Water Rock Knob sits at about 6,000 feet on the Blue Ridge Parkway near the southern end of the road, one of the highest points accessible by car in the southern Appalachians, and one of the most visited overlooks on the parkway because the parking lot is right there and the summit trail is only half a mile, and the view from the top, on a clear day, includes parts of 4 states and a panorama of ridgelines that stack against the horizon like waves frozen in stone. The parking lot is always busy, the summit trail is always crowded, but the Mountains to Sea Trail, which passes through the area on its way from the coast to the western mountains, is not. The MST in that section runs along the ridgeline below and south of the Water Rock summit, following the crest through a forest of spruce fir and high-elevation hardwood that feels more like Vermont than North Carolina. The trail is narrow, the tread is rough. The blazes are the white circles that the MST uses to distinguish itself from the Appalachian Trail's white rectangles. And the traffic is minimal because most people who visit Water Rock Knob take the summit trail and go home and never realize that one of the longest trails in the state passes within a quarter mile of the parking lot. I've hiked the MST through that section at least 30 times. I live in Waynesville, about 45 minutes from the Water Rock trailhead, and the ridgeline section is my go-to hike when I want elevation and solitude without a long drive. The section I walk is about 3 miles of ridgeline and out and back that follows the crest south from the parkway through terrain that is consistently above 5,000 feet, and that provides the particular experience of walking along the top of the world that high-elevation ridgeline trails provide. The ground falling away on both sides, the sky close, the wind constant, the sense of exposure that produces a state of mind that is simultaneously exhilarating and vulnerable. The trail does not fork. I need to establish this clearly because the fork is the story, and the fork's impossibility is the point. The MST in that section runs as a single track from the Parkway crossing to the point where it begins its descent into the Plot Balsam Range, approximately 3 miles south. There are no junctions, no spurs, no side trails, no alternate routes. The trail is one trail on one ridgeline going one direction, blazed with white circles at intervals of about 50 yards, maintained by the volunteer trail crews that the Friends of the Mountains to Sea Trail organize twice a year. I know the trail. I know every turn, every route crossing, every point where the spruce thins and the hardwood begins, and the canopy opens enough to show the view. There is no fork. The hike was on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of October 2023. I'd taken a half day from work, driven to the parkway, parked at the Water Rock lot, and started south on the MST around 1. The weather was overcast and cool, the temperature in the mid-40s at elevation, the kind of October afternoon that the high ridges produce when the cloud ceiling is low enough to brush the summit, and the air is heavy with moisture that hasn't quite become rain. The forest was in late fall transition, the hardwood mostly bare, the spruce holding its green, the trail surface covered with the wet, flattened leaves that October deposits on every horizontal surface in the mountains. I'd been walking about 45 minutes, roughly a mile and a half from the trailhead, when the trail forked. It appeared without preamble. One step, I was on the single track that I'd been walking for 30 hikes. The next step, I was standing at a junction where the trail split into 2 paths, each descending from the ridgeline in opposite directions. The left path went southwest, dropping off the ridge through spruce that gave way to hardwood within about 100 feet. The right path went southeast, descending through a similar transition. Both paths were the same width as the MST. Both had the same packed dirt surface. Both were blazed with the same white circles, freshly painted, at the standard intervals. Both showed the same wear patterns that maintain trails developed over years of foot traffic, the tread compressed, the edges defined, the surface clear of the deadfall and vegetation that would indicate a trail that was unused or recently constructed. I stood at the fork. The fork should not have existed. I knew this with the absolute certainty of a person who has walked this ridgeline 30 times and who knows that the trail is a single track that does not split and does not juncture and does not offer choices at any point between the parkway and the Plot Balsams. The fork was impossible, and yet I was standing at it, looking at 2 paths that were both the MST, both blazed, both maintained, both descending from a ridgeline that the actual MST does not descend from at this point. I chose left. The decision was not reasoned. It was instinctive, based on the orientation of the ridgeline, which runs roughly southwest in that section, making the left path the one that more closely followed the trajectory of the actual trail. The right path felt like it was going too far east, dropping toward a drainage that the MST doesn't enter until further south. Left felt correct. Left felt like the trail. I walked the left path for about a quarter mile. The trail descended steadily, the spruce giving way to hardwood, the canopy opening as the elevation dropped and the trees changed. The forest was different here. Not dramatically, not the kind of difference that announces itself. Different in the way that a room is different when one piece of furniture has been moved, a change that you feel before you identify it. The trees were the right species, but the spacing was wrong. The understory was the right density. Why, but the light coming through it was from the wrong direction. The slope I was descending faced west, which is not a direction that the MST faces at any point in the Water Rock section. The actual trail stays on the ridgeline or the east-facing slopes. I was on a west-facing slope on a trail that shouldn't have existed, D going in a direction that the MST doesn't go. The feeling started. Not fear, which is acute and specific. Not unease, which is vague and manageable. A certainty. A slow, building, bone-deep certainty that I had chosen wrong. Not lost wrong, which implies a navigational error that can be corrected by retracing steps. Wrong, wrong. The kind of wrong that doesn't have a correction. The kind of wrong that you feel when you've made a decision that has changed something permanently, and the change is happening around you while you walk, and the only thing you can do is feel it happening and know that the walking is making it worse. The trail was taking me somewhere specific, somewhere that the trail knew and I didn't. A destination that was pulling me toward it with the gentle, consistent force of gravity. Each step down the slope carrying me closer to a place that existed at the bottom of this descent, a place that the trail had been built to reach and that I had not intended to visit. The forest around me felt expectant, the way an audience feels expectant before a performance. The trees and the undergrowth and the trail surface charged with a quality of attention that suggested my arrival had been anticipated, and that whatever was waiting at the bottom of this slope was prepared for me. I turned around. I walked back up the slope, retracing my steps, following the white circles that I'd been following downhill, and that now led me uphill toward the ridgeline and the fork where I could choose again, could take the right path, could correct the wrong decision that the certainty in my chest was telling me I'd made. I reached the ridgeline. The fork was gone. The trail continued ahead of me as a single track, the same packed dirt surface, the same white circles, the same MST that I'd been hiking for 30 visits. But it continued in the direction I'd been walking. The left path, the wrong path, the trail that descended southwest toward whatever was at the bottom of the slope I just climbed back up. The right path, the one I'd seen from the fork, the one that went southeast, the one I hadn't chosen, was not there. The ridgeline showed no junction, no spur, no second trail. The right path had been removed, or it had never been there, or it was there only at the moment of the fork, and the moment had passed, D and the choice had been made, E and the option that I hadn't taken longer existed. I looked behind me. The trail I just climbed, the path that had brought me back to the ridgeline from the wrong slope, was the same trail that now continued ahead toward the wrong slope. I was standing on a trail that went in one direction, the direction I'd been trying to leave, the direction that I'd turned around to escape. The trail had absorbed my retreat. The distance I'd walked uphill had been incorporated into the trail that led downhill, and the net result was the same position on the same ridge with the same single trail going the same wrong direction. I stood on the ridge, E, and I looked at the trail ahead, and I felt the certainty settle into my chest, like a stone settling into water. I had chosen. The fork had offered two paths, and I had taken the left, and the right had disappeared. D and the left was now the only trail, and the only trail went somewhere that I hadn't intended to go. I didn't walk the left path again. I turned around, and I walked north, back toward the parkway, back toward the trailhead, following the white circles in the reverse direction, the trail that I'd hiked south an hour earlier. The trail was correct. The blazes were in the right positions. The terrain was familiar. The trail took me north along the ridgeline through the spruce and the hardwood and the wet October leaves, and in about 45 minutes I was at the Parkway crossing, and the parking lot was there, and my car was there. And the world was normal. I went back the following week. Same trailhead, same direction, same ridgeline. The trail ran as a single track for 3 miles south without a fork, without a junction, without a spur. The same trail I'd been walking for 30 hikes, no fork, no choice, no left path and no right path. Just the trail going where the trail goes the way it always has. But I think about the right path, the one I didn't take. The trail that went southeast from a fork that existed for maybe 5 minutes on a ridgeline where no fork has ever been. I think about what was at the end of it, where it led, what was waiting at the bottom of the slope that the right path descended towards. And I think about the left path, the one I chose, the one that the trail closed around when the fork disappeared, the wrong one. I think about the wrongness, the certainty that I had chosen incorrectly, that the left path was leading me to a destination I didn't want to reach. And I wonder if the right path was the same, if both paths led somewhere that no hiker should go. If the fork was not a choice but a test, not which path is correct, but what do you do when neither is? And I chose left, and the forest took the right, and the fork closed, and I'm still here, walking the ridgeline, walking the single track, walking the trail that doesn't fork and never has, and that, on one afternoon in October, opened a door to 2 places that don't exist on any map, and then closed the door and went back to being a trail. And whatever was at the bottom of those slopes, whatever the left path would have shown me if I'd kept walking, and whatever the right path would have shown me if I'd chosen it, is still there. At the end of trails that don't exist, behind a fork that appears once and disappears, waiting for the next hiker who walks the ridgeline alone on an October afternoon, and who reaches the point where the trail splits into 2 paths that are both blazed and both maintained and both wrong, and who has to choose. Graveyard Fields is one of those places on the Blue Ridge Parkway that earned its name honestly, and that carries the name with a weight that most visitors don't feel because most visitors don't know the history. The name doesn't come from a cemetery. It comes from the stumps. In the early 20th century, the area was logged, and the resulting fire, and the fire was hot enough and prolonged enough to consume the organic soil layer down to the mineral earth beneath, leaving a landscape of charred stumps that the early settlers thought looked like a graveyard, the stumps standing in rows like headstones across a blackened field. The forest has grown back since then, a second growth mix of hardwood and spruce that covers the old burn with a canopy that looks natural if you don't know what's beneath it. But the stumps are still there, under the leaf litter and the moss, hidden beneath the new forest the way bones are hidden beneath skin, the structural remnants of a landscape that was destroyed and rebuilt, and that carries the memory of its destruction in its name. I hike the trails around Graveyard Fields regularly. I live in Brevard, about 30 minutes from the Parkway, and the Graveyard Fields area provides access to a network of trails that I've been walking since I moved to Western North Carolina in 2019. The trails range from the easy paved path to the lower falls that attracts hundreds of visitors on summer weekends, to the rougher, less maintained routes that climb into the high country above the fields and that see significantly less traffic, especially in the fall when the leaf season ends and the parkway quiets down. The trail I was hiking was one of the less maintained routes, a path that climbs from the Graveyard Fields parking area through the second growth forest to a ridgeline that runs along the boundary of the Shining Rock Wilderness. The trail is about 3 miles each way, gaining maybe 1,000 feet of elevation. The surface a mix of packed dirt and exposed root, and the occasional rock step that trail crews have installed on the steeper sections. It's not a popular trail. On weekdays, and in the off-season, I can hike the entire 6-mile out and back without seeing another person, which is one of the reasons I choose it when I want to walk without the social obligations that crowded trails impose. I was hiking on a Tuesday in early November of 2023. The weather was overcast. The cloud ceiling sitting on the ridgeline at about 5,000 feet. The air damp and cool, the temperature in the low 40s. The forest was mostly bare, the hardwood having dropped its leaves in the previous 2 weeks, the canopy reduced to the skeletal architecture of branches that November reveals. The trail surface was covered with wet leaves, the brown and tan of oak, maple, and birch, compressed into a slippery layer that required attention with each step. I started walking around 9 in the morning. The parking lot had one other car in it, which likely belonged to someone hiking one of the other trails in the area. The trail register showed no entries for the day. I noticed the first cairn about a mile in. I'd stopped at a point where the trail crosses a small drainage, a seep that runs across the trail surface, and that requires a step or two on exposed rocks to keep your boots dry. I crossed the drainage and continued uphill for maybe 50 yards, and then, for no particular reason, I looked behind me. On the trail, at the exact point where I'd crossed the drainage, there was a cairn, a small stack of 3 flat stones, each about 4 inches across, balanced on top of each other, with the precise, deliberate alignment that cairn builders use when they want the stack to hold. The stones were local, the gray-brown sandstone that you find scattered throughout the trail surface and the surrounding forest, the flat, layered rock that the geology of the area produces in abundance. The cairn was maybe 8 inches tall. It was positioned in the center of the trail, directly on the spot where I'd placed my feet when I crossed the drainage. I looked at it. The cairn had not been there when I crossed the drainage. I'd been looking at the ground as I crossed, watching my foot placement on the wet rocks, paying the kind of attention to the trail surface that you pay when the footing is uncertain. There had been no stones stacked on the trail. The surface had been clear, and now, less than a minute after I'd passed, a cairn was standing at that exact position. I thought someone was behind me on the trail, a hiker who'd started after me and was catching up, and who was building cairns for reasons that hikers sometimes have, marking the route for a partner behind them, or indulging the inexplicable compulsion that some people feel to stack rocks wherever they find them. I looked down the trail. Empty. The path descended through the bare hardwood with enough visibility that I could see at least 200 yards behind me. Nobody was on the trail. The forest was empty. I continued walking. About a quarter-mile further, where the trail makes a broad switchback on the slope, I stopped and looked behind me again. A cairn. On the trail, at the approximate position where I'd been standing when I'd looked back and seen the first one, 3 stones, flat, stacked, balanced, the same size, the same construction, and the same central positioning on the trail surface. A second marker was placed at a second point that corresponded to a second position that I'd occupied on the trail. The pattern was established. I tested it. I walked about 200 yards and stopped and turned around. A cairn was there, at the point where I'd been standing before I started walking again. I walked another 200 yards, stopped, turned, cairn. Same construction, same positioning, same precision. Every time I stopped and turned around, a cairn had appeared at the position I'd previously occupied, placed on the trail surface in the time it took me to walk 200 yards, built by hands that were operating behind me on a trail where nobody was visible. I started looking back more frequently. Every few minutes, every 100 yards, the cairns appeared with the same consistency regardless of the interval. Short walks between checks produced cairns close together. Long walks produced cairns far apart. The spacing reflected my movement, not a fixed interval. The cairns were tracking me, marking my positions, recording my progress up the mountain with a series of stone markers that documented every point where I'd stopped and turned and looked behind me. I walked back to examine one. The nearest cairn was about 50 yards behind me, placed on the trail at a point I'd stood maybe 3 minutes earlier. I approached it. The 3 stones were balanced with a precision that I recognized from years of seeing trail cairns built by experienced hikers and trail crews. The edges were fitted. The weight was centered. The stack was stable enough that it would survive wind, rain, and the passage of time that collapses careless stacks within days. Whoever had built this cairn knew how to build cairns. I touched the top stone. It was warm. Not the ambient temperature of a stone that has been sitting in 40-degree air on an overcast November morning. Warm. The particular warmth that a stone acquires when it has been held in human hands. The residual body heat that transfers from skin to stone during the seconds or minutes that a person holds an object, and that dissipates slowly enough that the warmth is detectable for several minutes after contact. The stone had been held, recently, by something with body heat, by hands that had picked it up and carried it and placed it on top of 2 other stones with the careful, deliberate action of a cairn builder who was working with purpose and patience. I set the stone down. I looked at the trail behind me, empty. The visibility was good, the bare canopy allowing me to see far down the slope, the brown and gray of the November forest, providing a background against which any moving figure would be visible. Nobody was on the trail. Nobody was in the forest on either side of the trail. The warm stone in my hand had been placed by something that I could not see, and that had been following me up the mountain and marking my positions with the warm, precise, careful construction of a tracker who wanted a record of where I'd been. I hiked out, quickly. The pace of a person who has decided that the investigation is over and the priority is distance. I walked the 3 miles back to the trailhead in about 50 minutes, faster than my usual pace, the speed that urgency produces without requiring the decision to run. I didn't look behind me on the way down. I didn't want to know if the cairns were still appearing. When I reached the trailhead, I stopped at the edge of the parking lot, and I looked back up the trail. The trail climbed into the forest and disappeared around the first switchback about 100 yards from the lot. And along the trail, visible in the gray November light against the brown surface of the path, I could see them. The cairns. A line of small stone stacks stretching up the slope, each one marking a point where I had stood and turned and looked behind me, each one placed by hands that were warm and skilled and invisible. I counted 12 cairns in 3 miles. 12 markers documenting 12 moments when I had checked behind me and found a new stone stack where my feet had been. I went back the next morning, Wednesday, same trail, same conditions. I walked the first mile with the focused attention of a person looking for something specific. The cairns were gone. The trail was clean. No stacks, no markers, no evidence that 12 precise arrangements of local sandstone had been standing on the trail surface 24 hours earlier. But the stones were there. Not stacked, scattered, lying beside the trail at each of the 12 positions where the cairns had been. The flat sandstone pieces that had been balanced with such care now lying on the ground in loose piles. 3 stones here, 3 stones there. 12 groups of 3 scattered along 3 miles of trail as if someone had built them, and then, after I'd left, knocked them down, dismantled them, returned the stones to the random scatter that is their natural state, erasing the evidence of the construction while leaving the materials in place. I picked up one of the stones. It was cold, November cold, the temperature of a rock that has been lying on the ground overnight in 40-degree air. The warmth was gone. Whatever had held these stones and stacked them and placed them on the trail with the patient precision of a tracker marking positions had not returned to warm them again. The warmth had been a one-time offering, a signature, the residual evidence of contact between a hand that was warm and a stone that was cold, the brief thermal record of a touch that had occurred and ended and would not occur again. I've hiked the trail a dozen times since. The cairns have not returned. The stones lie where they were scattered, beside the trail at the 12 positions, slowly being absorbed by the leaf litter and the moss and the slow geological patience of the mountain. But I look behind me now. Every hike, every trail, not looking for cairns, looking for the gap between what I see when I look forward and what appears when I look back, the space where something operates, the interval between my passing and my checking, the few minutes of unobserved time that the trail behind me provides, the window during which hands that I cannot see can do work that I cannot witness and leave evidence that I cannot explain. Something was following me, something with warm hands and a knowledge of stone and a purpose that required my positions to be marked and my progress to be recorded and my path through the forest to be documented in a medium that would survive my departure and that would be dismantled only after I was gone. Something that I wanted a record of where I'd been, and that got one. 12 cairns, 12 positions. 12 warm stones were placed by 12 invisible touches on a trail where I walked alone through a forest named for a graveyard, and the record is gone now. The cairns are knocked down, and the stones are collected, and the evidence has been erased, but the tracker is still there. Somewhere behind me on the trail, patient, warm-handed, waiting for the next time I walk, and the next time I look back, and the next time I find, at the point where my feet were standing a moment before, a small stack of stones that says I was here, and so were you, and I'm closer than you think. Craggy Gardens is one of those places on the Blue Ridge Parkway that earns its reputation honestly, a high-elevation knob near Asheville, where the rhododendron grows in such density and such profusion that in June, the ridgeline turns pink and the parkway closes sections of road to accommodate the traffic of people who drive up to see the bloom. The rest of the year, Craggy is quieter. The rhododendron reduced to its dark green architectural presence. The views from the ridgeline spectacular in their seasonal variations. The trails empty enough that a person who wants to walk alone on a mountain can do so without seeing another human being for hours. I've been hiking the Craggy Gardens trail system since I moved to Asheville in 2017. The trails climb from the Parkway Visitor Center through rhododendron thickets and hardwood forest to a ridgeline that sits above 5,000 feet and that provides, on clear days, a 360-degree panorama that includes the Black Mountains to the north and the Great Craggy Mountains to the south and the Asheville Basin to the west and the ridgeline of the Blue Ridge, stretching in both directions until the curvature of the earth or the atmospheric haze absorbs it. The trails are well-maintained, well-blazed, and well-trafficked in summer. In November, they are empty. I was hiking on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of November 2023. The parkway at that elevation was approaching its winter closure. The road still open, but the facilities shuttered. The visitor center locked, the restrooms closed. The seasonal signs of an operation that was winding down for the winter, visible in the chained gates and the empty parking lots. I'd driven up from Asheville in the afternoon, parked at the Craggy Gardens lot, and started up the trail around 1:30 with the intention of hiking to the summit and back. A round trip of about 4 miles that takes a little over 2 hours at my pace. The fog came in around 2. I'd been climbing for about 30 minutes, gaining elevation through the rhododendron that dominates the lower section of the trail, when the first wisps of moisture appeared above me on the ridge. Fog on the parkway at elevation is common enough to be unremarkable. The valleys that surround the high ridges produce moisture constantly, the warm air from the lowlands rising and cooling as it climbs and condensing at the elevation where the temperature and the dew point meet. On days when the conditions are right, which is most days from October through April, the ridgelines above 5,000 feet are wreathed in fog that can range from a thin, transparent mist to an opaque wall of white that reduces visibility to near zero. The fog that settled on Craggy that afternoon was thick. Within about 5 minutes of the first wisps appearing, the ridge was socked in, the visibility reduced from the miles-wide panorama that the trail usually provides to a sphere of about 10 feet around my position. The fog was dense enough that the trees at the edge of the sphere were shapes rather than objects, the trunks and branches visible as dark vertical lines against the white, without the detail that proximity usually reveals. The trail surface was visible. The ground immediately around my feet was visible. Everything beyond the 10-foot boundary was white. I kept walking. Fog doesn't concern me. I know the trail. I had a headlamp in case the fog persisted until dark, and the trail was well blazed enough that 10 feet of visibility was sufficient to follow the white circles from one tree to the next. The fog added a quality to the hike that I sometimes prefer to clarity, the intimacy of a reduced world, the sense of walking in a room that moves with you, the ambient sound dampened by the moisture until the only things you can hear are your own footsteps and your own breathing, and the faint, wet silence that thick fog produces when it absorbs every other sound. I'd been in the fog for about 10 minutes when I noticed something that I initially attributed to the usual properties of fog in mountain terrain. The sphere of visibility around me seemed to be constant, not fluctuating the way fog normally fluctuates, thinning and thickening in response to wind currents and temperature gradients, and the micrometeorological variations that produce the swirling, dynamic quality that fog typically exhibits. The sphere was fixed, 10 feet of clear air around me in every direction, the boundary between the clear air and the fog as defined and consistent as a wall. The fog began at 10 feet, and it was absolute. The clarity ended at 10 feet, T, and it was complete. The transition between the two was not gradual. It was a line. I stopped walking. The sphere stopped. The fog held its position, the 10-foot boundary maintaining its distance from my body with a precision that I now recognized as unusual. When I'd been walking, the sphere had been moving with me, the leading edge parting ahead and the trailing edge closing behind with the smooth, coordinated motion of a system responding to my movement. And now that I'd stopped, the system had stopped too. The sphere was stationary. The fog was stationary. Everything was holding its position, frozen, as if the fog had been tracking my movement and had paused when my movement paused. I started walking again. The sphere started moving. I walked faster. The sphere accelerated, the fog parting ahead of me with the same pace that my boots were covering the trail, the leading edge of the clear air maintaining its 10-foot distance regardless of my speed. I slowed to a crawl. The sphere slowed. I stopped abruptly, mid-stride, 1 foot in the air. The sphere stopped at the same instant, not a beat after, not a moment later. The physics of air movement caught up with the change in my velocity. At the same instant, as if the fog were connected to my body by a mechanism that transmitted my motor commands without delay. The fog was not the weather. The weather doesn't respond to the movement of a person walking through it. Weather exists independently of the observers within it, following the physics of temperature and pressure and air movement that govern atmospheric behavior, regardless of who is standing in the middle of it. This fog was responding to me. It was tracking my position and adjusting its configuration to maintain a consistent sphere of visibility around my body, the 10-foot radius maintained with a precision that exceeded anything that natural atmospheric variation could produce. I tested it further. I turned around and walked back the way I'd come, reversing my direction on the trail. The sphere turned with me. The fog parted ahead of my new direction of travel and closed behind me where my old direction of travel had been, the clear air rotating around my position with the smooth, frictionless motion of a searchlight following a target. I turned again. The sphere followed. I walked in a circle, stepping off the trail and turning a full 360 degrees in the rhododendron beside the path. The sphere rotated with me, the fog maintaining its 10-foot distance in every direction as I turned, the clear air moving around my body with the responsive, attentive precision of something that was watching me and adjusting itself continuously to keep me at its center. I was inside the fog, not in it, which implies being surrounded by a weather system that exists independently of your presence. Inside it, the way you're inside a vehicle, contained within a structure that moves with you and that separates you from the environment beyond its walls. The fog was containing me, enclosing me in a 10-foot sphere of permitted visibility and carrying me through a landscape that I could not see beyond the sphere's boundary. Whatever was beyond the fog, whatever the mountain looked like, and whatever existed in the forest at the distances that clear air would have shown me, was hidden, blocked, withheld. I was being allowed to see 10 feet of the world around me, and no more, the fog functioning as a curtain that moved with me, and that lifted only to show me the ground beneath my feet and the trees within arm's reach, and nothing else. I hiked the rest of the trail inside the sphere. I had no choice. The fog showed no sign of lifting. G, in the alternative to continuing, was standing still on a ridgeline in November until either the weather changed or the light failed, neither of which was a better option than walking. The trail was navigable within the sphere. The blazes were visible one at a time, each white circle appearing at the edge of the clear air and passing through the sphere and disappearing into the fog behind me as I walked. The ground was visible. The rhododendron walls on either side of the trail were visible. The basic, immediate environment of the trail was available to me, and everything beyond it was not. The sphere carried me to the summit and back. I walked the full loop, about 4 miles, inside a 10-foot bubble of clear air that moved when I moved and stopped when I stopped and followed me with the attentive, responsive fidelity of something that had decided how much of the world I was allowed to see, and was enforcing that decision with absolute consistency. The summit, which normally provides the panoramic view that is the reward for the climb, provided nothing. The fog at the summit was the same as the fog on the trail, a white wall beginning at 10 feet and extending to infinity. The mountains and the valleys and the ridgelines and the sky, all replaced by the featureless, depthless white of a curtain that had been drawn around me and that was not going to open. I reached the trailhead. The parking lot was about 100 yards ahead, the pavement visible through the fog as a darker surface at the base of the trail. I walked across the lot toward my car, and as I approached the car, within about 10 feet of the driver's side door, the fog lifted. Not gradually, not in stages, not with the progressive thinning that fog exhibits when atmospheric conditions change, and the moisture begins to dissipate. Instantly, the sphere expanded from 10 feet to infinity in a single moment, the white walls retreating in every direction at a speed that was not physical, was not the speed of air moving or moisture dissipating, was the speed of something being withdrawn, pulled back, removed with the decisive, sudden efficiency of a curtain being opened by a hand that was done with the concealment and was ready to show whatever had been behind it. The parking lot was clear. The sky was clear. The ridgeline behind me, the ridge I just hiked, was clear. The rhododendron and the hardwood and the summit and the trail were all visible in the afternoon light with the crisp, detailed clarity that mountain air provides after fog. The landscape washed and sharpened by the moisture that had just departed. There was no fog on the ridge, not a wisp, not a remnant, not the lingering patches that fog leaves in sheltered hollows and north-facing slopes when the main body has lifted. The ridgeline was clean. I stood in the parking lot, and I looked at the mountain. And the mountain looked back at me with the particular, direct clarity that clear air produces. Every tree and every rock and every contour visible with a precision that told me the fog had not thinned or lifted or dissipated. It had been removed, taken away, pulled back by whatever had deployed it around me on the trail, and carried me through a landscape that it didn't want me to see. I've hiked craggy gardens in fog since then, 3 or 4 times. Each time the fog behaved the way fog is supposed to behave, drifting and swirling and thinning and thickening in response to the wind and the temperature and the atmospheric dynamics that govern the behavior of moisture in mountain air. Normal fog, independent fog, fog that exists on its own terms, and that doesn't care where I am, or how fast I'm walking or what direction I'm facing. But I remember the sphere. I remember the 10-foot boundary that moved when I moved and stopped when I stopped. I remember the precision of it, the engineered consistency of a system designed to maintain exactly 10 feet of visibility around a moving body. And I wonder what was beyond the boundary, what the fog was hiding, what existed on that ridgeline at that time on that afternoon that something decided I should not see. Because the fog wasn't blocking my view of the mountain. The mountain was always there, always the same, always visible after the fog lifted with the clarity that tells you nothing has changed. The fog was blocking my view of something else, something that was on the mountain while I was on the mountain, something that existed within the sphere's reach but that the sphere was designed to keep at a distance that I couldn't close and that my eyes couldn't penetrate, something at 11 feet, just beyond the boundary, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped, walking the trail with me, on the other side of the wall, separated from me by 10 feet of white nothing, and the decision of whatever controls the fog. That 10 feet was the distance it wanted, and 10 feet was the distance I would get. Devil's Courthouse is a massive rock outcrop on the Blue Ridge Parkway near milepost 422, a bald knob of exposed granite that rises above the surrounding forest like the dome of a building that the earth started constructing and never finished. The Cherokee called it Judicula's Seat, after a giant in their mythology who used the rock as a judgment throne, and the name that survives on the maps, Devil's Courthouse, carries a different mythology toward the same implication, that the rock is a place of judgment, a place where something sits above the landscape and looks down at the world beneath it, and decides things. The summit is accessible by a short, steep trail from the Parkway parking lot, about half a mile of paved path that climbs through spruce fir forest to the exposed rock at the top, where the view extends across the valleys and ridges of the southern Blue Ridge, with a breadth that makes the word panoramic feel inadequate. I hiked the longer trails around Devil's Courthouse rather than the summit trail, which is too short and too crowded for the kind of walking I prefer. The MST passes through the area, and several unmaintained spurs and old logging roads provide routes that extend the hiking into terrain that the summit tourists never see. The slopes below the courthouse, the drainages that feed the headwaters of the French Broad, the ridgelines that connect the courthouse to the surrounding peaks, in a network of high-elevation terrain that feels, at times, like the roof of the world. I was hiking one of these longer routes on a Monday afternoon in early October of 2024. The trail was an unmaintained spur that drops from the MST near the courthouse and descends through mixed hardwood to a creek about 2 miles below. I'd hiked it twice before and found it passable, The tread faded but followable. The blazes long gone. The route determined more by the contour of the terrain than by any remaining evidence of construction. The afternoon was overcast and cool, the temperature in the high 40s. The forest bare enough that I could see a good distance through the trees on either side of the trail, the November visibility that the Blue Ridge provides when the leaves are down, and the understory is open. I'd been walking about 30 minutes, descending steadily through a section of oak and hickory that occupied the upper slope of the drainage, when I heard the voice. It came from ahead of me on the trail, maybe 50 yards down the slope, around a bend where the trail curved to follow the contour of the hillside. Someone talking. Not loudly, not shouting, but at a conversational volume. The kind of speech that a person produces when they're talking to someone beside them, the volume calibrated for a listener at arm's length rather than across a room. A one-sided conversation, from what I could hear. The voice speaking in a continuous, pausing, continuing rhythm that indicates a person who is doing all the talking while the other party listens or isn't there. The voice was familiar. Not in the way that a friend's voice is familiar, where the recognition is immediate and the identification follows within a syllable. Familiar in a deeper, less conscious way, the way a sound is familiar when you've been hearing it your entire life but have never listened to it from outside. The cadence was recognizable. The particular rhythm of emphasis and pause, the way certain syllables were stressed and others were swallowed, the specific music of a speaking voice that has developed its patterns over decades of use. I knew the cadence. I knew the intonation. I knew the particular way the voice rose slightly at the end of statements that weren't questions, the uptick that some speakers produce when they're making a point and want the listener to confirm receipt. I walked faster. The slope was steep enough that the increased pace required effort, my boots slipping slightly on the wet leaves, my breathing increasing with the combination of speed and descent. The voice remained ahead of me, the same distance, the same volume, the gap between us maintained with the same precision that I'd experienced in other encounters on other trails, the constant separation that refuses to close regardless of speed. And then I recognized it. The voice was mine. The recognition arrived not as a sudden insight, but as a gradual convergence, the way a face resolves from a blur when you adjust the focus of binoculars, the features assembling themselves from ambiguity into specificity until the identification is complete and undeniable. The voice ahead of me on the trail was my voice. My pitch sits in the lower register of the male range. My cadence is the slightly rushed rhythm that I produce when I'm speaking about something I find interesting. My pronunciation, the particular way I handle the vowels and consonants of the Western North Carolina accent that I've absorbed over 7 years of living in Asheville. My voice, speaking words that I couldn't quite hear, carrying on a conversation with an intensity and a fluency that suggested the speaker was deeply engaged in whatever they were saying. I stopped walking. The voice stopped. The silence that followed was immediate and total, the way silence is total when the only sound in the environment ceases, and the background quiet of the forest, which you hadn't been aware of because the voice was filling the acoustic space, becomes the only thing your ears have to process. The forest was quiet, the wind was still, the voice was gone. I called out, "Hello, who's there?" The words left my mouth and entered the forest, and the forest absorbed them without reply. The acoustic deadness of a damp October hillside, the foliage gone, the moisture in the air dampening the sound, the words traveling maybe 100 yards before the terrain and the atmosphere consumed them. No response, no voice answering, no sound of any kind from the trail ahead. I started walking again. The voice started again. Same distance, same volume, same cadence. The same continuous, one-sided conversation that had been preceding me down the train resumed at the exact point where it had paused when I stopped, as if the voice had been waiting for me to move before it continued speaking. The correlation was the same one I'd felt in other encounters. The connection between my movement and the phenomenon, the mechanism by which my walking activated the sound and my stopping silenced it. I listened more carefully. I walked at a steady, moderate pace, and I focused my attention on the voice ahead, trying to resolve the words from the cadence, trying to extract the content from the container. The voice was mine. I was certain of this now, the identification confirmed by every acoustic detail that my ears could isolate. The pitch, the timbre, the resonance, the particular way the voice used the mouth and the throat and the nasal passages to produce sounds that were as unique as a fingerprint. But the words were blurred, not distant, which would imply a volume problem, not muffled, which would imply a barrier, blurred, as if the words were being spoken clearly, but the clarity was being removed before the sound reached me. The consonants softened, and the vowels stretched until the speech became a rhythm without meaning, the shape of language without the language itself. I could hear the structure of sentences, subject-verb-object patterns. Questions are identifiable by the rising intonation at the end. Statements, identifiable by the falling intonation. Emphatic phrases are identifiable by the increased volume and the compressed cadence that emphasis produces. My voice was having a conversation, a real conversation with structure and purpose and the emotional variations that natural speech contains. But the conversation was in a language that was both mine and not mine, the sounds of my voice forming words that I couldn't decode, as if the content of the speech was being conducted in a version of English that I should have understood, but that existed at a frequency or a level of meaning that my conscious mind couldn't access. I followed the voice for about a mile. The trail descended through the oak and hickory and crossed a small drainage where a seep emerged from the hillside and ran across the path before disappearing into the leaf litter below. The voice preceded me through every section, maintaining its distance, maintaining its volume, maintaining the continuous, engaged quality of a speaker who is saying something important to someone who is listening. I tried to close the gap 3 times, jogging brief sections of trail where the footing was stable enough. Each time the voice maintained its 50-yard separation, adjusting its pace to match mine. The sound stayed ahead with the effortless precision of something that knew exactly where I was and intended to stay exactly where it was relative to my position. The trail reached a viewpoint, a natural break in the canopy where the slope fell away steeply, and the view opened to the west, showing the valley below and the ridgeline beyond, the layered blue-gray panorama that the Blue Ridge produces on overcast afternoons when the moisture in the air turns every ridge into a paler shade of the one in front of it. The viewpoint was a flat rock, maybe 10 feet across, positioned at the edge of the slope where the trail curved around it before continuing its descent. The voice stopped, not at the rock, before the rock. About 50 yards before I reached the viewpoint, the voice ceased. The same abrupt, total cessation that it had produced when I'd stopped walking, except this time I hadn't stopped. I was still walking, still moving toward the viewpoint, and the voice had stopped anyway, terminated by something other than my movement, ended by a condition that had nothing to do with my pace and everything to do with the location. I reached the viewpoint. I stood on the flat rock, and I looked at the view, and I listened to the silence. The voice was gone, not paused, gone, with the particular quality of finality that distinguishes an ending from an interruption. The conversation, whatever it had been, was over. The speaker had said what they came to say, and the viewpoint was the period at the end of the sentence. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes. The forest was quiet. The view was gray and blue and beautiful in the muted atmospheric way. That the Blue Ridge is beautiful when the clouds are low and the light is flat, and the distance between the ridges is measured in shades of blue that deepen with each layer. Nothing moved. Nothing spoke. The voice that had been leading me down the trail was absent, and the absence felt permanent, the way an empty room feels permanent after the last person leaves, and the door closes, and the room reverts to the silence that is its natural state. I hiked back up the trail. The voice did not accompany me. The ascent was quiet, the forest producing only the normal sounds of wind, the distant call of a crow, and the crunch of my boots on the wet leaves. My voice, the one in my throat, the one I'd been born with and had been using for 43 years, was the only version of my voice on the mountain. I've thought about what the voice was saying, the words I couldn't hear, the conversation I couldn't decode. My voice, speaking with the fluency and the engagement that I produce when I'm talking about something that matters to me, saying things that I should have understood because the voice producing them was mine, the language was mine, and the speech patterns were mine. And I wonder if the voice was saying things I've already said, replaying conversations from my past, the accumulated verbal output of 43 years of speaking, repeated on a mountain by something that had recorded them and was playing them back for reasons I can't determine. Or if the voice was saying things I haven't said yet. Future conversations. The words I'll speak tomorrow, or next year, or in the last moments of my life, are previewed on a trail in the mountains by something that has access to a timeline I haven't reached yet. Or if the voice was saying things I'll never say, words that belong to a version of me that exists somewhere else, on a different trail, in a different life, having a conversation that I was close enough to hear and too far away to understand. I don't know what the voice was saying. I know it was mine. I know it was a conversation. And I know the conversation ended at a viewpoint on a mountain where the Cherokee believed a giant sat in judgment and looked down at the world below and decided things. And I wonder what was decided. And I wonder if the voice knew. And I wonder if the words I couldn't hear were the verdict. Rough Ridge is one of the signature hikes on the Blue Ridge Parkway, a short trail near milepost 302 that climbs from a parking area to a rocky outcrop where the view extends across the Lynn Cove Viaduct and the flanks of Grandfather Mountain with a grandeur that the parkway's marketing materials have been exploiting for decades. The trail itself is about a 1.5 mile round trip, boardwalk and rock steps, and the kind of engineered path that the parkway builds when it wants to channel large numbers of people through terrain that is both beautiful and fragile. It's a popular hike. On summer weekend, the parking lot fills before noon. The entire trail is a procession of families and couples and solo hikers carrying phones in front of their faces like offerings. But the section I'm going to tell you about isn't on the Rough Ridge Trail proper. It's on a connector that links the Rough Ridge parking area to the Tanawa Trail, a longer path that runs along the base of Grandfather Mountain and that provides access to terrain that the summit trail tourists never see. The connector is about 1/2 mile of narrow single track that descends from the parking area through a mixed forest of hardwood and rhododendron before joining the Tanawa at a junction marked with a wooden sign. The trail is well maintained but lightly used. The hikers who walk it typically heading for the Tanawa rather than Rough Ridge, and on weekday afternoons in the off-season, the connector is as empty as any trail on the parkway. The rhododendron tunnel is about midway along the connector, at a point where the trail passes through a thicket of Catawba rhododendron that has grown to a density and a height that is unusual even by Blue Ridge standards. The rhododendron in this section is old, the trunks thick and twisted, the branches interlocking overhead to form a canopy so dense that the trail becomes a corridor, a tube of vegetation with walls and a ceiling made entirely of the glossy, dark green leaves that rhododendron produces in such abundance that the interior of the thicket is always in shade, always damp, always several degrees cooler than the open forest on either side. The tunnel is about 200 feet long, the entrance and the exit visible from inside as circles of light at either end. The trail surface dark and soft, with the accumulated duff that rhododendron produces when its leaves fall and decompose in the perpetual shade beneath the canopy. I've walked through the tunnel at least 40 times. It's a feature of the hike that I've come to anticipate the way you anticipate any distinctive moment in a familiar experience. The transition from open forest to enclosed corridor, the temperature drop, the light change, the particular acoustic quality that the tunnel produces when the dense foliage absorbs all ambient sound, and the only thing you can hear is your own footsteps and the drip of condensation from the leaves overhead. The tunnel is a threshold, a passage between the open world of the parking lot and the wilder world of the Tanawa, and walking through it feels like walking through a door between two different versions of the forest. I was hiking on a Thursday afternoon in late September of 2024. The weather was warm and still, the temperature in the mid-60s, the kind of early fall afternoon that the parkway produces when the summer heat is broken but the fall cold hasn't arrived, and the air is comfortable in a way that requires no adjustment and no layered decisions. The forest was green, the canopy full, the rhododendron at its peak of late-season density, the leaves dark and glossy and producing the particular sheen that healthy rhododendron generates when the growing season has been long enough and wet enough. I reached the tunnel entrance around 2:30. The circle of green darkness that marks the beginning of the corridor was visible from about 50 feet away, the trail narrowing as it entered the thicket, the light dimming, the temperature dropping as the shade of the rhododendron canopy replaced the sun. I walked in. The tunnel was the same as it had always been for the first 50 feet or so. Dark, cool, green-filtered light, the soft, duff-covered trail surface. The walls of interlocking branches pressed close on either side. The corridor about 4 feet wide, just enough room to walk without brushing the vegetation with my shoulders if I stayed centered on the trail. The air was still, the particular, held stillness that dense vegetation produces when it blocks the wind and the air inside the thicket has nowhere to go. I noticed the movement at about the halfway point, roughly 100 feet in, the point where the tunnel is at its deepest and its darkest, and the entrance and exit are both visible as small circles of light at equal distances, ahead and behind. The walls moved, not with wind. There was no wind inside the tunnel. The air was motionless, the dense foliage blocking any current that might have been present in the open forest. The movement was in the branches themselves, in the rhododendron walls that formed the corridor on either side of the trail. The branches were contracting inward, slowly. The wall on my left pressed toward me, the leaves and the branches moving with a smooth, coordinated motion that reduced the width of the corridor by maybe 3 inches. Then the wall relaxed, pulled back, returned to its original position. A second later, the motion was repeated. Contraction, relaxation. Contraction, relaxation. A rhythm, steady, measured, about 1 cycle every 4 seconds. The right wall was doing the same thing, contracting and relaxing in synchronization with the left. The two wall pressing inward together and releasing together. The corridor narrowing and widening with each cycle, the diameter of the tunnel fluctuating by about 6 inches with each breath. Because that's what it was, breathing. The rhythm was the rhythm of respiration, the slow, steady, 4-second cycle that a large body produces when it's at rest. The inhale pressing the walls inward, and the exhale releasing them. The tunnel was breathing. I stopped walking. The breathing continued. The walls contracted and relaxed, the rhythm undisturbed by my presence or my cessation of movement. Whatever was producing the motion was not responding to me. It was producing the motion because producing the motion was what it did, the way lungs produce breathing, automatically, continuously, without reference to the observer. I started walking again. The tunnel was narrower now. The contractions had increased slightly in amplitude since I'd noticed them, the walls pressing closer with each cycle. The corridor that had been 4 feet wide at the entrance now maybe 3.5 feet at the deepest point. When the walls contracted, I could feel them against my shoulders, the rhododendron leaves brushing my arms and the sides of my torso with a contact that was light and consistent, the touch of vegetation against skin that should have felt like any other brush with a plant, and that felt instead like something else entirely. The leaves were warm. Rhododendron leaves in a shaded tunnel in September should be cool. The temperature inside the tunnel was lower than the open air by several degrees. The shade and the density of the canopy, producing a microclimate that keeps the interior of rhododendron thickets cooler than the surrounding forest. The leaves that were touching my arms should have been cool. They were warm, not the warmth of sun-heated foliage, which the shade precluded. Body warm. The particular, recognizable warmth of living tissue at a temperature that is regulated by metabolism rather than by environment. I walked faster. The tunnel was 100 feet from the exit, the circle of light at the far end visible and growing as I approached. The walls continued their rhythm, contracting and relaxing with the same 4-second cycle, the leaves brushing my arms with each contraction, warm and soft and alive. The touch was gentle, not aggressive, not constraining. The light, brushing contact of a surface that is moving slowly and that happens to be touching you as it moves. The way the wall of a narrow hallway touches your shoulder when you walk through it, without centering yourself perfectly. But the warmth changed the contact from incidental to intimate. The leaves against my arms were the temperature of skin. The branches that pressed against my shoulders during each contraction were the temperature of a body. The tunnel, the entire 200-foot corridor of rhododendron that I'd been walking through for 40 hikes, was warm in the way that a living thing is warm. The vegetation producing heat from an internal source that had nothing to do with the sun and nothing to do with the ambient temperature and everything to do with the quality of aliveness that the breathing had already suggested. I was inside something, not a tunnel of vegetation, something that was using vegetation as its medium, something that breathed with a 4-second cycle and that was warm, and that lined the trail with its body the way a throat lines the passage of air, the corridor of the trail running through it, the way a windpipe runs through the body that contains it. I was walking through a structure that was alive, that was breathing around me, that was warm against my skin when the walls pressed close, and that was watching me in whatever way a living tunnel watches, with the passive, encompassing awareness of something that contains you and that feels you moving through its interior, the way you feel food moving through your throat. I emerged from the tunnel into the open forest at the far end. The light returned, the temperature equalized. The walls of the corridor were behind me. I turned and looked back at the tunnel entrance. The circle of darkness at the opening was contracting and expanding with the same rhythm, the same 4-second cycle, the diameter of the entrance, narrowing and widening by about 6 inches with each breath. The rhododendron leaves at the edge of the opening, pressing inward and pulling back with the slow, steady, mechanical rhythm of respiration. I watched for about a minute. The breathing was visible from outside the tunnel, the way breathing is visible in a sleeping person, the subtle, rhythmic movement that the body produces when it's at rest, and that you don't notice until you're looking for it. The tunnel was breathing. From the outside, looking in, the motion was unmistakable. The walls of the corridor moving with the coordinated, synchronized precision of a system that has been breathing for a very long time and that has no intention of stopping. Then it stopped. The walls held their position. The entrance was still. The rhododendron was the rhododendron again, a thicket of vegetation forming a dark corridor over the trail, motionless and cool and green, and exactly what it had always been on every other hike I'd taken through it. The breathing had stopped. The warmth, presumably, had dissipated. The tunnel was a tunnel. I've walked through it since, 4 times. Each time, the tunnel is still and cool and dark, and the rhododendron is vegetation and nothing more. I walk through it, and I wait for the movement and the warmth and the 4-second rhythm, and I feel nothing except the normal brush of leaves against my arms when the corridor is narrow, and my shoulders extend beyond the center line of the trail. But I remember the warmth, the body temperature leaves against my skin, the slow, rhythmic contraction that pressed the walls against my shoulders and released them, and pressed again. The feeling of being inside something that was breathing, not walking through a space that contained breathing. Inside the breathing itself, contained by it, carried through it. The trail running through the body of something that used the rhododendron as its tissue and the tunnel as its passage, and that breathed around me while I walked, and that was warm against my arms, and that watched me with the encompassing, interior awareness of something that doesn't need eyes, because you are already inside it, and it can feel you the way you feel your own heartbeat, from within, without looking. The knowledge of presence achieved through contact rather than observation. And I wonder if the tunnel is always breathing, if the 4-second cycle is always running, always expanding and contracting, always warm and alive and aware of the hikers who pass through it. And I wonder if the breathing is usually so subtle that nobody notices, the motion so small and the warmth so faint that the thousands of people who walk that corridor every year feel nothing except a slight narrowing that they attribute to the vegetation, and a slight warmth that they attribute to the exertion, and a slight touch that they attribute to their shoulders, brushing the rhododendron. And maybe it is just rhododendron, and maybe the movement was wind, and the warmth was sun, and the touch was leaves, and the breathing was my imagination. And maybe the tunnel is just a tunnel, but my arms remember what they felt, and my arms say it was alive. The overlook is at milepost 361 on the Blue Ridge Parkway, a pull-off with a low stone wall and a wooden sign that identifies the view, the elevation, and the names of the ridgelines visible from the position. It's not one of the famous overlooks, not the kind that appears in guidebooks or that draws busloads of tourists during leaf season. It's a quieter stop, a wide spot on the parkway where 4 or 5 cars can park, and where the wall provides a comfortable place to lean while you look at a panorama that extends maybe 30 miles to the southwest across the Pisgah Valley and the ridgelines. that stack behind it in shades of blue, that deepen with distance. I found it in my first year in the area, driving the parkway on a Sunday afternoon in October, and I've been returning to it about once a month since. 4 years, about 50 visits. The same view, from the same position, in every season, and every weather condition, and every quality of light that the Blue Ridge produces. Mountains don't change on timescales that humans perceive. This is one of the comforts of hiking in the Appalachians. The knowledge that the ridgeline you're looking at looked essentially the same 100 years ago, and will look essentially the same 100 years from now. The human world changes. The farms expand and contract. The roads are built, repaired, and rerouted. The houses appear and disappear with the economic cycles that determine whether a valley is growing or shrinking. But the mountains hold, the ridgelines hold. The shape of the landscape, the deep geological architecture that underlies everything else, is permanent in a way that human constructions are not. This is what makes the view from milepost 361 reliable. The valley is the valley. The ridges are the ridges. The panorama is the panorama. 50 visits over 4 years. And the view has never changed because the mountains have no reason to change. And the valley has changed only in details that are invisible from 2,000 feet above. I drove up on a Saturday morning in the second week of March 2024. The parkway at that elevation was still in its late winter state. The road open, but the facilities closed, the trees bare, the landscape stripped to the brown and gray palette that the mountains wear from November through April. The morning was clear, the sky blue, the visibility, the particular crystalline clarity that cold, dry air produces in the mountains when the atmospheric moisture is low and the haze that summer generates is absent. Good visibility, the kind of morning where the view from the overlook extends to its maximum distance and the detail in the valley is sharp enough to identify individual buildings and road patterns. And the church steeple that I use as a reference point when I orient myself at the wall. I parked. I walked to the wall. I looked at the view. The valley was wrong. The shape was correct. The ridge lines that framed the valley on both sides were in their correct positions, the familiar silhouettes that I'd been looking at for 4 years. The creek that runs through the valley floor was visible in the same position, the silver thread that catches the light and provides a reference line from which the rest of the valley's geography can be measured. The topography was right. The valley was the valley. But the contents were not the contents I knew. The farmland was gone. The patchwork of fields and pastures that covers the valley floor. The green and brown and gold rectangles that agriculture produces when it organizes land into parcels and manages each parcel according to a crop rotation or a grazing schedule was absent. In its place was a forest. Unbroken forest, the dense, continuous canopy of old-growth hardwood that hasn't existed in the Pisgah Valley since the logging era of the early 20th century, when the timber companies removed every merchantable tree from every accessible slope, and the farms that followed the loggers cleared the valley floor for agriculture. The forest I was looking at was the forest that had existed before all of that, before the loggers, before the farmers, before the roads and the houses and the church and the power lines and everything that human settlement had placed on the valley floor in the 200 years since the first European families arrived. The roads were gone. Route 276, which runs through the valley from Brevard to the Parkway, was not there. The secondary roads that branch from 276 to serve the farms and the houses were not there. The power lines that follow the roads were not there. The cleared corridors that roads and power lines produce in forested landscapes. The straight lines of absence that mark human infrastructure from the air and from overlooks like this one were absent. The valley was unbroken green, the canopy extending from the base of the ridge on one side to the base of the ridge on the other without interruption. The houses were gone, the farmhouses and the barns and the outbuildings that dot the valley floor, the white and red and weathered gray structures that are visible from the overlook as small shapes against the green and brown of the agricultural landscape, were not there. The valley showed no evidence of human habitation. No cleared lots, no driveways, no roof lines. No evidence that anyone had ever built anything in the valley, or lived in it, or modified it in any way. The church steeple was gone. The white steeple of the Baptist church that sits on a low hill near the center of the valley, The landmark I use to orient myself when I look at the view was absent. The hill was there. The same hill, the same shape, the same position relative to the creek and the ridgelines. But the steeple that has been on that hill for at least 100 years was not on it. The hill showed nothing but trees, the same old-growth forest that covered the rest of the valley, unbroken and uncleared. The canopy growing on the hilltop the way it grew on every other surface in the valley, as if the hill had never been cleared, and the church had never been built, and the congregation that had been meeting in that building for a century had never existed. I was looking at the valley the way it had looked before civilization arrived, before the Cherokee trails became wagon roads, and the wagon roads became highways. Before the first cabin was built in the first clearing, the first field was plowed, and the first crop was planted. The valley in front of me was 200 years old, maybe 300, maybe older, the unmodified, uncleared, unoccupied landscape that the mountains had been wearing since the last ice age retreated, and the forests climbed back up the slopes and covered everything with the dense, patient, biological persistence that defines the Appalachians. I took out my phone. I opened the camera. I held the phone up to my eye and looked at the screen. The screen showed the normal valley, the farms, the roads, the houses, the church steeple, white against the green of the hill, exactly where it always was. Route 276 is visible as a gray line running through the patchwork of fields, the power lines, the cleared lots, the contemporary, inhabited, modified valley that I'd been looking at for 4 years. The phone was seeing the present. I lowered the phone and looked with my eyes. The old valley, the forest, the unbroken canopy, the absence of everything that human beings had added to the landscape over 2 centuries. I raised the phone. The present. I lowered the phone. The past. The 2 valleys occupied the same space, the same topography, the same ridge lines, the same creek, but different contents, different eras, different versions of the same place, separated by 200 years and by the thickness of a phone screen. My phone and my eyes were looking at the same valley from the same position at the same moment, and they were seeing different things. The phone was seeing what was there now. My eyes were seeing what had been there before. I stood at the wall for about 10 minutes. I raised and lowered the phone a dozen times, each time confirming the discrepancy, each time seeing the present through the screen and the past through my eyes. The 2 valleys alternated with each lift and lower, the modern landscape appearing and disappearing with the mechanical reliability of a switch being toggled, the phone providing access to one version, and my naked eyes providing access to the other. Then the old valley faded. Not abruptly, not in a single moment. Gradually, the way an image fades when the light changes and the contrast diminishes, the forest thinned, not the trees falling or disappearing. The visibility of the forest was reducing, the opacity of the canopy diminishing until the forest was translucent, and the shapes of the contemporary landscape were visible through it, the farms and the roads and the houses emerging from behind the trees, the way objects emerge from fog when the fog lifts. The old valley became a ghost of itself, the canopy still present but no longer solid, the ancient forest showing through to the modern one, the way a palimpsest shows the original text through the overwriting. And then the old valley was gone. The modern valley was there, clear and sharp and present, the farms and the roads and the steeple and the power lines all in their correct positions, the view exactly what it had been on every previous visit. I lowered my phone. I looked with my eyes. The modern valley, the same view on the screen and through my eyes. The discrepancy was gone. My eyes and my phone agreed. I've been back to the overlook every month since. 8 visits. Each time the view is the modern valley, the farms, the roads, the steeple, the present. My eyes and my phone show the same thing, the same valley, the same era, the same version of the landscape that everyone sees when they pull off the parkway at milepost 361 and lean on the stone wall and look at the view. But I carry the other view with me, the valley without roads, without houses, without the steeple on the hill. The valley as it was before anyone changed it. The original landscape. The one that the mountains wore before the first axe was swung and the first field was cleared, and the first building was raised. I carry it because my eyes showed it to me. And my phone didn't. And the difference between what my eyes saw and what the camera recorded tells me something that I don't fully understand, but that I feel with the particular bone-level certainty that accompanies experiences that exceed the frameworks we use to explain them. The mountains remember. That's what I think when I stand at the wall and look at the view and see the modern valley and know that beneath it, or behind it, or within it, the old valley is still there. The mountains remember what they look like before we change them. The forest that was cut is still there, somewhere, in a version of the landscape that human eyes can sometimes see and human cameras cannot. The valley before settlement is still the valley. The ridgelines still hold it. The creek still runs through it. The old growth still covers the slopes and the hilltops and the valley floor with the dense, unbroken canopy that 200 years of human activity removed from the physical world, but not, apparently, from the world that the mountains maintain beneath the surface of the present. A memory held in stone, visible on certain mornings, from certain positions, to certain eyes that are looking at the right place at the right time. Me, with the willingness to see what the phone cannot capture and what the mountains have never forgotten. Looking Glass Rock is one of the most recognizable features in the Pisgah National Forest. A massive granite dome that rises above the surrounding forest like the hull of an overturned ship. The exposed rock face, reflecting sunlight, with a brightness that gives the formation its name and that makes it visible from miles away on clear days. The trail to the summit is about 3 miles each way, climbing about 1,700 feet through mixed hardwood and laurel before reaching the exposed rock at the top, where the view extends across the Pisgah in every direction with the kind of grandeur that justifies the effort of the climb. It's a popular hike. On weekends, the parking lot fills early. And the trail is a continuous line of hikers moving uphill and downhill with the steady, patient traffic that popular trails produce. On weekdays, especially in the off-season, the trail is quieter, and in the right conditions, at the right time of day, and the right weather, and the right disregard for comfort, you can hike it alone. I was hiking on a Wednesday morning in early November of 2023, the day after a heavy rain that had dropped about 2 inches on the Pisgah overnight. The rain had stopped around 3 in the morning, and the morning was overcast and cool, the temperature in the mid-40s, the forest dripping with the residual moisture that heavy rain deposits on every surface, and that takes hours to evaporate from the canopy and the understory and the trail surface. The trail was muddy, not the firm, slightly yielding mud that well-drained trails produce after moderate rain. The deep, soft, holding mud that clay-based trail surfaces develop when the rain has been heavy enough to saturate the soil beyond its capacity to drain, the kind of mud that accepts a boot print with the completeness of wet plaster and holds the impression with the fidelity of a mold. I started at the trailhead around 8. The parking lot was empty, my car, the only vehicle, the trail register showing no entries for the day. I was alone on the mountain, which was the intention. Wednesday mornings in November, on a trail that requires a 1,700-foot climb, do not attract casual hikers. The trail was mine. The mud started about a quarter mile in, at a point where the trail crosses a drainage, and the clay substrate that underlies the trail surface in that section becomes exposed when the rain washes away the leaf litter and the thin layer of topsoil that normally covers it. The mud was deep, maybe 2 inches, soft enough that each step left a complete impression of my boot sole. The tread pattern, the heel shape, the size, the particular configuration of lugs and channels that the manufacturer designed into the sole. And that my year of hiking in these boots had modified with wear. I was about a mile in, climbing through a section of mature oak, when I saw the prints, boot prints, in the mud ahead of me, on a section of trail I hadn't walked yet. My first thought was that another hiker had started before me, early enough that I hadn't seen their car at the trailhead. I looked at the prints with the passing attention that you give to evidence of other people on the trail, the casual assessment that hikers make when they want to know how far ahead the other party is and how fast they're moving. The prints were fresh. The detail was sharp, the edges of the tread pattern clean and defined, the mud still wet enough in the impression that the prints couldn't have been more than a few hours old. I walked alongside the prints for about 50 yards, my boots making new impressions in the mud next to the existing ones. Then something caught my attention: the tread pattern. The specific configuration of lugs on the sole, the shape, the spacing, and the depth of the channels between them. I recognized the pattern. It was my boots, the same thread, the same brand. The specific outsole design that Salomon uses on their X Ultra series, a pattern that I've been looking at on the bottom of my own boots for a year, and that I would recognize the way you recognize any design that you see daily. I stopped. I knelt beside one of the prints, and I looked at it closely. Then I placed my right boot in the mud beside it and pressed down with the same weight I use when I walk. They lifted my boot and looked at the two impressions side by side. They were identical, not similar, not the same brand and the same size. Identical, the same tread pattern, the same size, the same depth, the same wear. The wear was what stopped me. Boot soles wear in patterns that are unique to the wearer, the way fingerprints are unique to the person. My right boot has a slight asymmetry in the heel wear, the outside edge worn slightly more than the inside, the product of the mild pronation that my right foot produces when I walk. The pronation is subtle, barely visible to the naked eye, but it's consistent, producing a wear pattern that a year of hiking has carved into the rubber of the outsole with the cumulative precision of 1,000 miles of foot strikes on rock, dirt, and root. The print in the mud showed the same asymmetry, the same wear on the outside edge of the right heel, the same subtle, consistent, biomechanically specific pattern that my right foot produces and that no other foot produces in the same way. I looked at the prints ahead of me on the trail. They extended uphill through the mud, each impression clear and detailed, the right boot showing the pronation wear, and the left boot showing the slightly different wear pattern that my left foot produces. Each print pressed into the clay with the depth and the pressure distribution that my body generates at my weight and my walking pace. My prints, my boots, my gait, my weight, pressed into mud on a section of trail I hadn't walked yet by a set of boots that matched mine in every physical detail. I followed them. The prints continued uphill for about a quarter mile through the muddy section, each impression identical to the last, the stride length consistent, the pace steady, the depth uniform. Whoever or whatever had made these prints had been walking uphill at approximately my pace, in boots that matched mine, with a gait that replicated my biomechanics with an accuracy that went beyond coincidence and into something that the word duplication barely covers. The prints ended where the trail surface changed from clay to the exposed rock and root that constitutes the upper section of the Looking Glass Trail. The terrain was too hard to hold impressions, and the record of the boot prints terminated at the boundary between soft ground and solid ground. I hiked to the summit. The rock section showed no evidence of passage, no mud transferred from boots to stone, no disturbance in the thin layer of grit and organic debris that accumulates on rock surfaces between rains. If someone wearing my boots had walked the muddy section, they had either not continued to the summit or had left no trace on the rock surface, which was possible if the boots were clean, which they shouldn't have been if they'd just walked through a quarter mile of clay. I hiked back down. The descent brought me back through the muddy section, and now there were two sets of prints in the clay. Mine, the ones I'd made on the way up, walking uphill on the left side of the trail, and the other set, the ones that had been waiting for me, were walking uphill on the right side. Two sets of identical boot prints, side by side, ascending the same slope in the same direction, one set made by me, and one set made by something that had walked this trail before me, wearing boots that replicated mine in every measurable detail. I walked beside them. My descending prints added a third set to the mix, the downhill impressions showing the different pressure pattern that descent produces. The weight shifted toward the heel, the toe lighter, the stride shorter than the uphill prints. Three sets of prints, two going up, identical, one coming down, different. The math of a hiker who walked up and back. Except one set of the uphill prints wasn't mine. I went back the next day, Thursday morning. The weather is dry, the overnight temperature having dropped enough to begin the drying process that converts wet clay from a soft recording medium to a hard, cracking surface that doesn't hold detail. I hiked to the muddy section and looked at the prints. One set remained, One set of boot prints going uphill through the clay, the tread pattern, the wear pattern, and the stride length and the depth, all consistent with my boot, my gait, and my weight. My prints. The prints I'd made on Wednesday morning were of me walking up the trail. They were there, preserved in the drying mud with the fidelity that clay provides when the conditions are right. The other set was gone. The prints that had been waiting for me, the identical impressions that I'd found on a section of trail I hadn't walked yet, made by boots that matched mine in every detail, were not there. The mud where they'd been was smooth, not filled in, not washed out, not disturbed by weather or animals or the passage of other hikers. Smooth, the way mud looks when nothing has pressed into it, the surface unbroken, showing no evidence that a boot or anything else had made contact with it at any point. The prints had not been eroded. They had been unmade. The impressions removed from the clay the way a footprint is removed from wet sand when the wave comes in. The surface returning to its original state, as if the contact had never occurred. One set of prints, mine, the only set that belonged to me. The other set, the one that had preceded me up the mountain, the one that matched my boots and my gait and my pronation and my weight with the precision of a copy made by the thing being copied, was gone, erased, withdrawn. The evidence of its passage was removed from the trail surface with the same thoroughness that had characterized its placement, leaving nothing behind except the memory of what I'd seen and the photographs on my phone that I'd taken before the prints disappeared. The photographs show two sets of identical boot prints side by side in the mud. The detail is clear. The tread pattern is legible. The wear pattern on the right heel is visible in both sets. The same asymmetry, the same pronation, the same year of accumulated biomechanical specificity. The photographs prove that on a Wednesday morning in November, two sets of boots walked the same trail in the same direction, through the same mud, and left the same impressions. And by Thursday, one set was gone, and one set remained, and the remaining set was mine. I've hiked Looking Glass Rock a dozen times since. I check the mud when the conditions are right, after heavy rains, when the clay is soft enough to hold prints. I've never found a set of prints waiting for me again. The trail shows only the prints that I make as I make them, the impressions forming under my feet in real time, the way impressions are supposed to form, the mud recording my passage as I pass through it rather than before. My boots leave prints behind me, not ahead of me, the way it's supposed to work. But I think about the prints that were already there, the boots that walked my trail before I walked it, the thing that wore my shoes and used my gait and carried my weight up a mountain that I hadn't climbed yet. And I wonder when it walked. In the night, in the rain, in the hours between the storm ending at 3 in the morning and my arrival at 8, 5 hours in which something wearing my boots climbed the same trail I would climb and left the same prints I would leave, and then disappeared, leaving behind only the impressions in the mud to tell me it had been there, and that it had walked where I would walk, and that it knew, before I left my house and before I drove to the trailhead, and before I took my first step on the muddy trail, exactly which boots I'd be wearing, and exactly how my feet would fall. Something walked my future, and left it in the mud, and erased it after I'd seen it, and went wherever it goes when the evidence is gone, and the trail is clay, and the only prints that remain are the ones that belong to the present tense. Linville Falls sits at the edge of the Linville Gorge in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, a place where the Linville River drops over a series of rock ledges into the gorge below with a force and a beauty that has been drawing visitors to this section of the mountains since the parkway was built. The falls are accessible by maintained trails from the parkway, short hikes that lead to overlooks where the water is visible from above and from the side, and where the mist from the falls rises in the air and catches the light and produces the particular, luminous quality that moving water creates when the conditions are right. The trails around the falls are well maintained and well trafficked, the kind of parkway hiking that families and casual walkers enjoy because the distance is short and the payoff is immediate. But the trails that extend beyond the falls overlooks, the ones that continue into the gorge and along the rim and into the forest that surrounds the tourist infrastructure, are different. These trails are longer, rougher, less maintained, and significantly less visited. They pass through terrain that the parkway's managed landscape doesn't reach, old forest and rhododendron thickets, and the steep, rocky slopes that characterize the gorge rim, terrain that is wild in the genuine sense of the word, rather than the curated sense that the parkway applies to its showcase trails. I was hiking one of these longer trails on a Thursday afternoon in late October of 2023. The trail ran along the gorge rim about a mile east of the falls, following the contour of the ridge through a forest of mixed hardwood that was in the late stages of its fall transition, the canopy mostly bare, the understory brown, the trail surface carpeted with the wet leaves that October deposits on every path in the mountains. The afternoon was overcast, the light gray and flat, the kind of light that the Blue Ridge produces when the cloud ceiling sits on the ridge lines and the forest loses its color and becomes a study in shades of brown and gray. I'd been walking for about an hour, alone, the trail empty ahead and behind. The only sounds the crunch of leaves under my boots and the distant murmur of the river in the gorge below. The forest at this elevation is a mix of oak, hickory, and hemlock, with dense rhododendron thickets filling the gaps between the larger trees, the glossy-leaved evergreen occupying the understory with the particular, impenetrable density that rhododendron achieves when the growing conditions are right. Tea in the canopy above provides enough light for the lower layers to thrive. The rhododendron in this section was especially thick, forming walls on either side of the trail that were 10 or 15 feet tall and so dense that visibility into the thicket was limited to about a foot before the interlocking leaves and branches blocked the view. I heard the singing from about 20 yards off the trail, from deep inside a rhododendron thicket on the downhill side of the path, the side that dropped toward the gorge. The sound emerged from the thicket the way a scent emerges from a kitchen, gradually, the first awareness of it arriving before the conscious recognition of what it was. I was walking, and then I was listening, and the transition between the two states happened without a decision, the singing capturing my attention, the way any unexpected sound captures attention in a forest where the only expected sounds are natural ones. It was a woman's voice. Alto, rich, the kind of voice that voice teachers describe as warm, the lower register of the female range, where the sound carries body and resonance without the brightness that soprano voices produce. The singing was unhurried, the melody unfolding at a pace that suggested the singer was in no hurry and had no audience and was producing the sound for reasons that had nothing to do with performance or communication. Private singing, the singing that a person does when they're alone and the song is something they know so well that the singing requires no conscious effort, and the melody produces itself the way breathing produces itself, automatically, from a depth that is below intention. The melody was familiar, not recognizable, not identifiable, but familiar in the way that a scent can be familiar without being placeable, the way a chord progression can be familiar because it shares structural elements with 1,000 other progressions that your ears have processed over a lifetime of hearing music. I almost knew the song. The melody hovered at the edge of recognition, the notes arranging themselves in a pattern that my brain kept reaching for and not quite grasping, the way you reach for a word that you know, and that refuses to form on your tongue. A hymn, maybe, or a lullaby. Something old. Something that belonged to a tradition that I'd been exposed to as a child and that I hadn't heard since. The musical vocabulary of the mountain churches, and the mountain porches, and the mountain kitchens where women sang while they worked. And the songs they sang were the songs their mothers had sung, and their grandmothers before. I stopped walking. I stood on the trail and I listened. The singing continued from the thicket, the melody cycling through what appeared to be a single verse repeated, the same sequence of notes circling back to the beginning with each completion, the singer apparently content to repeat the same passage indefinitely, without variation or development. The voice was beautiful. I want to be clear about this because the beauty is part of the story. Rye and the beauty is part of what kept me standing on that trail longer than I should have stayed. The voice was genuinely, deeply beautiful. The kind of singing that produces a physical response in the listener, a loosening in the chest, a softening in the muscles of the face, the involuntary relaxation that beauty triggers when the brain encounters something that meets its criteria for aesthetic pleasure. I stood and I listened. and the beauty held me the way warmth holds you when you've been cold, with a comfort that is its own justification. But the fear was there. Underneath the beauty, underneath the melody and the voice and the private, intimate quality of the singing, there was something wrong. I felt it before I identified it. The way you feel the wrongness in a room before you identify the detail that's producing it. Something about the singing was not right, not the perfect pitch, not the tone, which was rich and warm, not the beautiful melody, something else. Something that the beauty was partially concealing and that my body was detecting even as my mind was being held by the aesthetics. The voice didn't echo. I identified the wrongness about 30 seconds into my listening, the analytical part of my brain finally catching up with the instinctive part that had been signaling alert since the singing began. The voice produced no echo, no reverb, no acoustic reflection of any kind. In a rhododendron thicket, which is essentially a chamber of dense foliage with walls and a ceiling and a floor, sound should bounce. The hard, glossy surfaces of rhododendron leaves reflect sound the way they reflect light, producing the particular acoustic quality that dense vegetation creates in enclosed spaces, a slight reverb, a softening of the hard edges of sound, the acoustic evidence that sound waves are interacting with the physical environment through which they travel. Every sound in a rhododendron thicket should have reverb. The crunch of leaves should echo slightly off the walls. A voice should produce reflections that layer on top of the original sound and give it the spatial quality that tells your ears the sound exists in a physical space with dimensions and boundaries. This voice had none. The sound traveled from its source to my ears in a straight line without touching anything between. No bounce, no reflection, no interaction with the leaves and the branches and the dense foliage that filled the space between the singer and the listener. The voice arrived clean, pure, unmediated by the environment in which it was supposedly produced. It sounded the way a voice sounds in headphones, direct and close, and stripped of the spatial information that tells your brain where the sound is coming from and how far away it is and what kind of space it's occupying. The voice sounded like it was inside my head, not figuratively, physically. The acoustic properties of the singing, the absence of reverb, the absence of spatial information, the direct, intimate, close quality of the sound were consistent, not with a voice in a thicket 20 yards away, but with a voice that was being produced inside my auditory cortex, the part of the brain that processes sound, the place where sound becomes hearing. The singing wasn't traveling through the air. It was arriving at my perception without the medium that sound requires for travel. It was in my ears without having been in the air between the thicket and my ears. I walked away. The decision was made by the part of my brain that had been signaling fear since the singing started, the part that the beauty had been overriding, the instinctive, pre-rational assessment system that evaluates threats faster than conscious thought, and that had concluded, before my conscious mind caught up, that a beautiful voice coming from inside a rhododendron thicket that produces no echo and no reverb and no acoustic evidence of physical existence is not a voice that a person should be standing close to. I walked north on the trail, back toward the falls, the direction I'd come from, putting distance between myself and the thicket with the steady, deliberate pace of a person who is not running, because running would be an acknowledgement of fear, and the situation has not yet earned the dignity of being feared, but who is walking with a purpose and a speed that is faster than the casual pace I'd been maintaining before the singing started. The singing continued behind me, the same melody, the same voice, the same private, beautiful, reverb-free alto that had been coming from the thicket and that now followed me as I walked, the volume not diminishing with distance the way a sound in the physical world diminishes when you move away from it. The singing maintained its volume, the same loudness at 50 yards that it had been at 20, the same closeness, the same intimacy, the same inside-the-head quality that had been wrong from the beginning and that was now, with the distance growing between me and the thicket, confirming what the acoustic analysis had already suggested. The singing was not coming from the thicket. The thicket was where the singing appeared to originate, but the actual source was somewhere else. Somewhere that distance didn't affect. Somewhere that my walking couldn't increase my separation from. And because the source was not in the forest behind me, but in the space between the forest and my perception. The singing continued for about 5 minutes after I walked away. 5 minutes of the same melody, the same cycle, the same beautiful, private, reverb-free voice, producing the same old song on the same eternal loop. I counted the time because counting was something my mind could do while my body walked and my ears listened, and the fear that the beauty had been concealing grew with each step I took that didn't reduce the volume. Then it stopped. Not gradually, not fading with distance, not trailing off at the end of a phrase. Stopped. Cut. The voice ceased in the middle of a note, the sound terminating with the abruptness of a recording being switched off. The melody interrupted at a point that was not a natural pause, and not a musical resolution, but a severance. The note present and then absent, and the silence that replaced it, filling the forest with a quality of emptiness that was worse than the singing. The silence was the loudest thing I've ever heard, not metaphorically. The silence that followed the cessation of the singing had a volume, a physical presence, a weight that pressed against my ears the way sound presses against your ears at a concert, the auditory system straining to process an input that it cannot reconcile with its expectations. The silence was loud because the singing had been in my head, and the singing's absence was in my head, and the head, which had been full of beautiful music for 5 minutes, was suddenly empty, and the emptiness was deafening. I hiked the rest of the trail in that silence. The normal sounds of the forest, the wind, the leaves, and the river in the gorge, were present but distant, muffled by the ringing emptiness that the singing had left behind. I reached the falls overlook in the parking lot, and my car and I drove home, and the silence came with me. Not the literal silence of a soundless environment, but the echo of an absence, the space where a voice had been, inside my head, singing a song I almost knew, with a beauty that was real, and a presence that was not, in a thicket where the rhododendron couldn't hear it, and the leaves couldn't reflect it, and the only audience was the part of my brain that processes sound and that, for 5 minutes on a Thursday afternoon in October, processed something that didn't come from the air. I've walked past that section of trail a dozen times since. The thicket is the same, dense, dark, green. The rhododendron is impenetrable beyond the first foot. I listen every time I pass. I slow my pace and I turn my head, and I wait for the singing, the alto, the melody, the voice that was beautiful and wrong, and inside my head, silence. The normal silence of a forest in whatever season I'm walking through. No voice, no melody. No singing from the thicket where the leaves don't reflect sound, because there was never any sound to reflect. But I still almost recognize the melody. In quiet moments, in the space before sleep, in the particular silence that my apartment produces at 2 in the morning, when the noise of the day has died, and the brain is sorting through the inputs it received, and filing them in the categories where they belong. In those moments, I hear it, the melody, the cycle. The notes are arranging themselves in a pattern that my brain keeps reaching for, and each time I almost grasp it. Each time the song is closer to being identified, the way a memory moves closer to the surface each time it's recalled. And I think that one day I'll recognize it. One day the melody will resolve from familiar to known, and I'll understand what the voice was singing and who the voice belonged to and why it chose to sing for me, inside my head, in a thicket where the rhododendron couldn't hear it, and the forest couldn't hold it, and the only room the singing occupied was the room in my mind where the music lives. And I think that when I recognize the song, the singing will come back. And this time, it won't stop. The shelter is one of the backcountry structures that the Blue Ridge Parkway maintains along its trail system, a 3-sided wooden structure with a metal roof and a raised sleeping platform, and the kind of austere, functional design that the parkway builds when it wants to provide overnight accommodation without encouraging the comforts that might make people stay longer than the backcountry experience warrants. The shelter sits about 2 miles from the nearest trailhead, on a ridge that runs east from the parkway through a section of the Pisgah National Forest that sees moderate hiking traffic in summer and almost none in the off-season. The approach trail climbs through mixed hardwood, gains about 600 feet, and deposits you at the shelter with a view to the east that includes 3 ridgelines and a valley, and the kind of sunset panorama that the Blue Ridge produces when the atmospheric conditions align, and the light does what light does in the mountains, which is transform the ordinary into something that justifies the climb. I overnight at the shelter about 3 or 4 times a year. I'm a solo hiker, a 46-year-old woman who works remotely and who has organized her life around the ability to disappear into the mountains for a night or two whenever the need arises, which is frequently. The shelter is one of my regular destinations, close enough to the parkway that the approach hike is manageable with an overnight pack and remote enough that the chance of sharing the shelter with another hiker is low, especially on weeknights and in the months between October and April when the parkway's seasonal traffic drops to near zero. I hiked in on a Tuesday afternoon in the third week of October 2023. The weather was clear and mild, the temperature in the low 50s, the forest in peak fall color, the ridgeline trail a corridor of orange and gold that the late afternoon sun was lighting from the side with the amber intensity that October produces in the hour before sunset. I reached the shelter around 4:30, set up my sleeping pad and bag on the platform, cooked dinner on my camp stove, and sat on the platform edge watching the sunset paint the ridgelines to the east in shades that progressed from gold to orange to the deep, bruised purple that the mountains wear in the minutes after the sun drops below the horizon, and the light is all reflection and no source. The sunset was exceptional. The clouds were the right kind, high cirrus that caught the light at altitude and redistributed it across the sky in streaks and bands that turned the entire eastern horizon into something that looked more like a painting than a weather event. I watched until the color faded and the ridgelines went dark, and the first stars appeared in the purple going to black of the sky above the mountains. I decided to write in the shelter log. The log is a waterproof notebook in a plastic box mounted to one of the shelter's interior posts, the standard trail shelter log that hikers have been writing in since the shelter was built, a running record of the people who pass through and the weather they encounter and the things they see and the particular diary-like intimacy that shelter logs encourage when a person is alone in the mountains at night, and the notebook is the only audience available. I opened the log and found a pen in the box, a blue ballpoint that someone had left, and I wrote an entry. The date, my name, the weather is clear and mild with high cirrus clouds, and a note about the sunset, a few sentences describing the color and the way the clouds had caught the light, and the progression from gold to purple that I'd watched from the platform. I wrote it the way I write all my shelter log entries, conversational and specific, the voice of a person talking to whoever would read the notebook next, sharing an experience that might be useful or might be beautiful or might just be evidence that someone was here and saw this and wanted to record it. I closed the notebook. I put it back in the plastic box. I zipped into my sleeping bag and read by my headlamp for about 30 minutes, and then I turned off the lamp and went to sleep. The shelter at night is quiet in the way that mountain structures at night are quiet, which is to say not quiet at all, but filled with the layered sound of forest doing what forest does after dark, the wind and the owls, and the small sounds of animals moving through the leaf litter and the particular, rhythmic creak that the shelter's roof produces when the temperature drops and the metal contracts. I slept well. The sleeping bag was warm. The platform was flat. The night was clear, and the wind was light, and nothing disturbed my sleep in any way that I was conscious of. I woke at dawn. The light was gray, the pre-sunrise light that the eastern-facing shelter catches before the sun clears the ridgeline. The quality of illumination that is enough to see by, but not enough to read by. The transitional light between the headlamp and the day. I made coffee on my camp stove, ate a granola bar, and watched the light build on the ridgelines as the sun climbed behind the mountain and the shadows retreated down the slopes. I opened the shelter log. I wanted to add a note about the sunrise, which was shaping up to be as good as the sunset, the morning light hitting the clouds from below and producing the pinks and oranges that sunrise clouds generate when the atmospheric moisture is at the right level, and the angle of the sun is at the right elevation. My entry from the previous evening was there, the date, my name, the weather, the sunset description, blue ink, my handwriting, everything as I'd written it. Beneath my entry, separated by about half an inch of blank space, was another entry. The handwriting was not mine. It was written in black ink, not the blue ballpoint I'd used, a finer line, the kind of mark that a felt-tip pen produces rather than a ballpoint. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, the letters formed with the careful, unhurried precision of someone who writes slowly and well, each character distinct, the spacing even, the overall impression of a hand that has been writing for a long time, and that treats the act of writing with a respect that suggests the writer values the permanence of the written word. The entry was addressed to me, by name. My first name, the name I'd written in my own entry, used in the response the way you'd use a person's name in a letter or a conversation, the familiar, direct address that establishes a connection between the writer and the person being written to. The response commented on my sunset description. It said the sunset was better from the North Ridge. It said this with the conversational authority of someone who had seen the same sunset from a different vantage point and who was offering a comparison, the way a fellow hiker might say, you should have seen it from where I was standing. It said the clouds had been the right kind. It used the phrase, the right kind, in quotation marks, echoing the language I'd used in my own description, where I'd written the clouds were the right kind, the phrase that I'd chosen because it felt more accurate than any technical meteorological term, and that the response was now quoting back to me with the specificity of someone who had read my words carefully and was engaging with them on their own terms. The response said I should come back in November. It said the light lasts longer at the angle I'd described. It said November produces a version of the sunset that October can't match because the sun is lower and the clouds are higher. And the geometry of light and atmosphere creates a color palette that the October angle doesn't access. The advice was specific, informed, the kind of recommendation that a person makes when they've watched sunsets from this ridge every month and have developed preferences based on sustained observation. Nobody had been in the shelter. I'd been alone all night. The shelter is 100 yards from the nearest trail, and the approach is through forest that produces audible footsteps on the leaf litter regardless of how carefully a person walks. I'd heard nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, no sound of a pen on paper or a plastic box being opened, or any of the small, unavoidable noises that a person produces when they enter a structure and open a notebook and write in it. The shelter had been silent all night. I had been the only person on the platform. I looked at the handwriting. I touched the ink with my fingertip. It was dry, not freshly dry. The slight tackiness that ink retains for the first few minutes after application. Completely dry. Set. The kind of dry that ink achieves after hours of exposure to air. The absorption complete, the mark permanent. The entry had not been written moments before I woke. It had been written long enough ago that the ink had fully set. I looked at the pen I'd used, blue ballpoint, still in the plastic box where I'd left it. No other pen in the box. No felt tip marker. No black pen of any kind. The instrument that had been used to write the response was not in the shelter. Whoever had written beneath my entry had brought their own pen and taken it with them when they left. I read the entry again. 3 sentences. My name. A reference to my sunset description. An invitation to come back in November. Conversational. Warm. Personal. The voice of someone who was responding to what I'd written, not as a stranger reading a public log, but as a person who was continuing a conversation that my entry had started, a dialogue in which my description of the sunset was the opening statement and the response was the reply. A conversation conducted in writing, in a notebook, in a shelter on a ridge in the mountains, between a woman who wrote an entry and went to sleep, and something that read the entry and responded and left no evidence of its presence except the handwriting on the page. I packed up. I hiked out. I drove to the Parkway office. E and I showed the log to a ranger I knew, a woman named Dalton who had worked the Parkway for about 10 years. She looked at the entries, mine and the response. She read the response twice. She looked at the handwriting. She looked at the ink. She closed the notebook and was quiet for a moment. She said shelter logs sometimes have unusual entries. She said it the way Parkway rangers say things that they've said before and that they know don't explain anything. She said hikers write things in shelter logs that don't always correspond to the hikers who were present. She said it with a careful ambiguity that told me she had seen entries like this before and that she had a policy of not investigating them. I asked her if anyone else had reported responses in the log. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said one other person, a man who had overnighted at the same shelter about 2 years earlier and who had written an entry about the moonrise and had found, the next morning, a response that commented on his description and suggested he come back during the full moon in January when the light on the snow was best. She said the man had been alone in the shelter. She said the response was in handwriting that didn't match any entry in the log and in ink that didn't come from any pen in the box. She said the response addressed him by name. I've overnighted at the shelter twice since then. Both times I've written in the log. Both times I've checked in the morning. Both times my entry was the only entry. No response. No black ink. No recommendation about when to come back. The notebook holds what I put in it and nothing more. But I think about the handwriting. Neat, deliberate, careful. The writing of someone who values the act of writing and who treats the shelter log as a medium for conversation rather than a record of passage. And I think about the content, the specificity of it, the knowledge of the sunset from the North Ridge. The assessment was that the clouds had been the right kind. The recommendation for November. Whoever wrote the response had been watching the same sunset I'd been watching, from a different position, with the experienced eye of someone who has been watching sunsets from this ridge for a long time. And they wanted me to know. They wanted me to know that the sunset had been seen, that my description was accurate, that there was someone else on the mountain who had been watching and who appreciated what the light had done, and who thought I should come back and see it again, in a different month, from a different angle with a different quality of color. And I wonder if they're right, if November is better, if the light lasts longer and the angle produces colors that October doesn't reach. And I wonder if the invitation is standing, if the handwriting in the notebook was an offer made once and withdrawn, or an offer that remains open, waiting for me to return, to write another entry, to describe another sunset, and to find, in the morning, beneath my words, the neat black handwriting of someone who was there and who saw it too and who wants to talk about the light. Mount Pisgah sits at about 5,000 feet on the Blue Ridge Parkway south of Asheville, a prominent peak that the parkway wraps around on its way south through the Pisgah National Forest. The mountain is accessible by several trails that radiate from the parkway like spokes from a hub, the most popular being the Summit Trail that climbs from the Pisgah Inn parking area to the observation platform at the top, a 1.5 miles of steep, well-maintained path that rewards the effort with a view that extends across the French Broad Valley to the Great Smokies on the western horizon. The other trails are longer and less trafficked, loop routes that descend from the parkway into the forest below and that provide the kind of extended hiking that the Summit Trail's popularity doesn't accommodate. I hike a loop near Pisgah that I've completed at least 20 times, a 5-mile circuit that drops from the parkway down the south slope of the mountain, through mixed hardwood, follows a creek through a drainage for about a mile, and then climbs back to the parkway on a ridge trail that arrives at a trailhead about 1/2 mile from where I started. The loop takes about 3 hours at my pace and provides the particular satisfaction that loop trails offer. The feeling of traveling through changing terrain without retracing your steps, the narrative arc of departure and return that out and back trails don't achieve. I've been hiking this loop since I moved to Asheville in 2020, first as exploration and then as routine, the trail becoming part of my regular rotation, the one I do when I want a solid 3-hour hike without driving more than 20 minutes from my house. I was hiking on a Saturday morning in late November of 2023. The weather was cold and clear, the temperature in the low 30s at the trailhead. The sky was the hard, bright blue that November produces at elevation, when the humidity is low and the atmospheric haze that summer generates has been scrubbed away by the cold. The forest was bare, the hardwood stripped of its leaves, the canopy open to the sky, the trail surface covered with the compressed, brown layer of fallen leaves that November deposits and that the winter rain and the foot traffic compress into a firm, slightly slippery surface that lasts until the spring growth replaces it. I parked at the trailhead around 8:30. The lot was a gravel pull-off that held maybe 6 cars, accessed from the parkway by a short spur road that dropped about 50 feet from the parkway surface to the lot. My car, a dark blue Subaru, was one of 3 vehicles in the lot when I arrived, the others being a pickup truck and an SUV that I assumed belonged to hikers who'd started earlier or who were accessing a different trail from the same lot. I signed the trail register, a notebook in a wooden box mounted on a post at the edge of the lot, noting my name, the date, and my intended route. I started walking at 8:45. The hike was normal for the first 4.5 miles. The descent through the hardwood was familiar, every switchback and every creek crossing in its expected position, the trail behaving the way it has on every previous hike. The creek section was quiet and cold, the water running low in the November drought, the sound of the creek reduced to the thin musical trickle that mountain streams produce when the flow is minimal, and the rocks were mostly exposed. The ridge climb was the usual sustained effort, the trail gaining about 700 feet in about a mile, the grade steep enough to make my legs aware of themselves and my breathing audible in the cold, still air. I reached the trailhead at approximately 11:30. The trail emerged from the forest at the edge of the gravel lot the same way it always does, the trees thinning and the ground leveling and the man-made surface of the lot appearing ahead through the bare hardwood. I could see the trail register post. I could see the wooden sign with the trail name. I could see the gravel surface and the cars parked on it. The cars were wrong. I noticed the colors first. The vehicles in the lot were painted in colors that I can only describe as off. Not the specific, calibrated shades that modern automotive manufacturers use. The reds and blues and whites and grays that are assigned codes and applied with the precision that factory painting achieves. These colors were different. Faded in some cases, saturated in others, the kind of paint that looks like it was applied by a process that didn't achieve the uniformity that modern paint technology produces. The colors looked like they belonged to a different era of manufacturing, an earlier time when automotive paint was less precise, and the results were more variable. And the colors aged differently than modern paints age. I looked at the vehicles. There were 4 of them. The first was a sedan of a make I didn't recognize, a boxy, angular design that looked like something from the late 1970s or early 80s, the kind of car that the American auto industry produced before the aerodynamic designs of the 90s changed the visual vocabulary of passenger vehicles. The second was a station wagon with wood grain paneling on the sides, the faux wood applique that was standard on certain models in the 70s. The panels yellowed with age, the chrome trim dulled. The third was a pickup truck, an older Ford or Chevrolet, the body style dating to maybe the early 80s, the paint a flat green that didn't correspond to any color I'd seen on a modern vehicle. The fourth was a small car, foreign, possibly Japanese, with the square, upright design that characterized small cars in the late 70s. My car was not in the lot. The space where I'd parked, the third space from the left, was occupied by the station wagon with the wood grain paneling. The station wagon had a bumper sticker on the rear. It was for a national park. Not a national park I recognized. Not one of the well-known parks, not Yellowstone or Yosemite or the Smokies. A park name I'd never heard of. A name that sounded like it could be a national park, but that didn't correspond to any park in the National Park Service's system. The sticker was aged, the colors faded, the edges peeling, the kind of deterioration that bumper stickers show after years of exposure to sun and rain. I walked to the trail register. The wooden box was there, mounted on the same post, in the same position. The notebook inside was there. I opened it. The entries were in handwriting that looked normal, the varied scripts that hikers produce when they sign a trail register. Names, dates, and routes are the standard information that register entries contain. But the dates were wrong. The month and day formats were familiar, the standard numeric notation that Americans use. But the years were numbers I didn't recognize. Not past years that I could identify as dates from a specific decade. Not future years that I could calculate from the current date. Numbers that didn't correspond to any year in any calendar I know how to read. 4-digit numbers that started with digits I didn't associate with years. Configurations that my brain couldn't parse into a temporal reference. Dates that existed in a system of timekeeping. That was not the system I use. I looked at the lot again. The 4 vehicles sat in the gravel with the static, parked for a while quality that cars develop when they've been sitting long enough that the dust has settled and the engine heat has dissipated. The license plates were from North Carolina and Tennessee, the correct states for a parking lot on the Blue Ridge Parkway. But the plate designs were wrong, not expired designs from previous years that I might recognize from seeing them on older vehicles. Designs I'd never seen. Formats, color schemes, and graphic elements that didn't match any plate currently or previously issued by either state. The plates looked official. They had the correct state names and the correct formatting of numbers and letters that license plates use. But the specific designs, the backgrounds, the logos, and the slogans that states print on their plates were from a version of North Carolina and Tennessee that I had never lived in. I stood in the parking lot. T and I looked at the car, D, the register, the trail sign, and the gravel surface, and I felt the particular, dislocating vertigo that comes from recognizing every element of a familiar environment and realizing that the environment itself is not the one you know. The trailhead was correct. The spatial relationships were correct. The trail register was in the right place. The sign was in the right place. The gravel was the right gravel. Everything was present and accounted for in the right configuration, but the content was wrong. The cars were from the wrong time. The plates were from the wrong version. The register entries used the wrong years. I was standing in a trailhead that was mine in every structural detail, and not mine in every temporal detail, a parking lot that existed in the right place in the wrong when. I turned around. I walked back into the forest. The trail was the same trail I'd been walking for 3 hours. The familiar tread, the bare hardwood, the November leaves on the ground. I walked about 100 yards, far enough that the trailhead was no longer visible behind me, the trees closing in with the density that the forest maintains, even when the leaves are down. I stopped. I turned around. I walked back to the trailhead. My car was there, dark blue Subaru, third space from the left, the same space where the station wagon with the wood grain paneling had been 2 minutes earlier. The lot had 3 vehicles, my Subaru, a pickup truck, and an SUV. Modern vehicles. Current plate designs. The trail register showed entries with today's date and dates from the previous weeks and years that I recognized. 2023, the year I was living in. The parking lot was my parking lot. The trailhead was my trailhead. The world was the world I knew. I walked to my car. I put my hand on the hood. The metal was cold, the temperature of a vehicle that has been sitting in 30-degree air for 3 hours. My car, my hood, my cold metal. I got in, and I sat in the driver's seat. T and I looked at the parking lot through the windshield, LED, and everything was normal and present and correct in mine. I've hiked the loop a dozen times since. Each time I reach the trailhead and find my car, the lot is normal, and the register shows today's date. The experience has not repeated. The wrong parking lot, the one with the old cars and the unrecognizable plates and the register entries in years that don't exist in my calendar, has not appeared again. I walk out of the forest and into the present. T in the present is where I am, and where my car is, and where the dates make sense. But I think about the station wagon, the wood grain paneling, the bumper sticker for a national park that doesn't exist. The license plate from North Carolina isn't the North Carolina I live in. And I think about the register, the entries in years that I couldn't read, the dates from a system of timekeeping that isn't mine. And I wonder what version of the parkway the station wagon was parked on, what version of the trail had those hikers walked, what version of Mount Pisgah they had climbed, and what version of the view they had seen from the top, and what version of the forest they had descended through on their way back to a parking lot that exists in the same space as mine, but in a different layer of whatever the mountain holds, beneath the version that I'm allowed to see. The parkway has been here since the 1930s, but the mountain has been here for 300 million years. And in 300 million years, the mountain has held a lot of versions of itself, a lot of forests, and a lot of creatures, and a lot of weather systems, and maybe a lot of parking lots, each one occupying the same coordinates, each one real to the people who parked in it, each one invisible to the people who parked in the others. And maybe the trail doesn't just cross distance, maybe the trail crosses time, and maybe the trailhead where you emerge isn't always the trailhead where you started. And maybe the mountain decides which version you walk out into, the one you know or one you don't, the present or the something else. And most of the time the mountain gives you your own parking lot with your own car and your own date on the register. And sometimes it doesn't, and you stand in a gravel lot with cars from a decade you can't identify, and plates from a state you don't recognize, and a register full of dates that don't exist in any calendar you've ever used. And you turn around and walk back in, and hope that the next time you walk out, the mountain gives you yours.